This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses.
Okay, people ask what I do for a living. I'm actually Greg Wallace's PR guy. In this video, I kind of wanted to make this for a couple of reasons. So I've been chatting with Kyle, who started chatting this year, I think probably related to Friedman stuff. He's from up north, but that's fine. But he's been asking me in DMs, like, he's thinking about getting a quad cortex, and then he was saying, do I need to get an FRFR, like atomic wedge or something like that? And then he's like asking other questions, and then he kind of stopped himself and said, by the time I've done this, won't it have cost about the same as like a good amp? This is a guy who already has some amazing Friedman amps, some Soldanos, like incredible gear. And I was kind of like, yeah, I'm probably going to make a video on this so that we can talk about it. And then I was also talking to a huge amp company. I'm not allowed to say who because of NDA, but about they were asking me questions about what I gig with and why and decision making stuff on some of that. And I kind of thought it was interesting because there weren't necessarily good reasons for my decisions, but there are reasons for a lot of them. So this is a video about why I've switched back to using amps live. And this has been a decision I made a little while ago. In this intro, I'm going to be using the Helix amp in the room tones. Incidentally, at home, I'm basically always using a modeler. So that's kind of the thing. So, modeler at home, amps live. I think it makes quite a lot of sense. That you do occasionally see people asking, like, is this silent stage thing even real? It definitely is. So talk to your local guitarists and ask them. I think in a lot of places, certainly in the UK, even my buddies who are like super, like Jake for instance, super amp purist, like doesn't even use a modeler at home, except maybe UA plugins sometimes, is kind of thinking like, the way that sound people are talking to him, sound men, if you prefer me to use that term, Connor, specifically, and Kevin, he's kind of thinking like, why am I still bothering with these amps, especially when loadings are difficult sometimes, and he's in-ears anyway. There is a real pressure that people should be maybe considering going towards a modeler if you're working in the function scene, or if you're touring, all of those things. So just, it is a real thing, right? People working as guitarists are really being asked, like, can you turn way down, or maybe can you not bring an amp at all? Incidentally, if you've ever been to a gig like this, in like a pub, for instance, because I think there are some guitarists that are on in-ear gigs, but then you go to a pub scenario and you're like, can you hear the guitar? Oftentimes not. I think that's the thing that John Sir has kind of said about as well. And for me, that is one of those things that I've definitely been in the experience of, was like where you're playing live and you're like, can people actually hear this guitar solo? I'm someone who generally tries to keep volume relatively tame, you can believe that, but that's kind of me. And then you take your solo and you think, well, is anyone really hearing that? Probably not. So anyway, for me, the amp excels at the live situation. It's obvious, that's what they're for. If you've still got a live drummer on stage, that's going to be your loudest thing, unless you're Matt Schofield or Robin Ford. You can afford for there to be an amp on stage in most venues, probably. So, for me, playing with an amp on stage is more fun, feels better, and actually is a bit easier to get the amp-like interaction things going. So it sometimes might be necessary, like at the end of a big rock tune, to go to your amp and get a little bit of feedback, right? It's not the most useful thing in the world for most of the gig, but sometimes, and particularly in my function band, for instance, towards the end of the second set, there's quite a lot of 80s bangers, and it's kind of really nice to just have an amp on stage moving some air. We're not talking like excessive volumes, and I only use a 1x12. I use a Mesa Boogie 1x12 with an EVM speaker in the back, so it's plenty loud enough. And I don't know if there are still people out there using 4x12s. If you are, let people know in the comments and they can praise you for that. What I found is, so I was using a Modeler Live and I was trying lots of other things to kind of get that stage volume. So some amount of stage volume for me is necessary. I run in my band the PA and sound, so I'm kind of in charge of that. So for me personally, as a sound guy, I kind of like to let the PA take care of the vocals and the keyboard, and then I quite like having the guitar coming from a different source, so it's not super crowded in the front of house. But that for me is quite a good thing, you know, in venues that I'm playing, like maybe to 100, 200 people at a dodgy wedding, or in a pub it would be, you know, 50 to 100. But I think it actually, in these smaller size venues, actually does make sense not to have everything coming out of the front of house and that being your only sound source, for me personally. So I quite like having the guitar helped by that stage volume, and certainly when I'm playing on stage it does help sometimes. And I've definitely played in venues where your drummers crack it, like the Firehouse, where it's a really small stage and it was really hard to hear stuff. So there is an argument for keeping stage volumes slightly lower so you can hear things better. But if you've got two guitars using amps on stage, a drummer and a bassist, things just necessarily get louder. I think that's the nature of live music in general. I kind of decided that I was going down this route of trying these FRFR things, like a power cab. Fender FR12 I tried, which I thought is actually a really good thing for this, but a Fender FR12 is the same size as a combo, about a similar weight, and if you just have a head and cab, you're not really making any space saving with like the Fender FR12, who someone's borrowing that at the moment. I don't know if they'll bother to get it back. Anyway, so my rig is like pedals into an amp and then into an HX Stomp, which goes to front of house. So I don't have a mic on stage. The modelling kind of goes to the front of house. I probably think that probably just sounds just as good as if I was to stick a mic somewhere on the cab, right? Maybe better than that. For home use, I wouldn't necessarily go down the FRFR route either. For home use, for me, I'm always going into my JBL LSR 305s. And these are not expensive speakers. I did have a company offer to send me some very expensive speakers for free, but I thought it didn't really make much sense because I'm really happy with what I've got already. So that's what I use at home, and then live I'll use an amp. If it's an in-ear gig only, they probably won't even want you to use an FRFR anyway. So for that, you're just using in-ears, and that's about the worst gig experience you can have, in my opinion. But it is working. So that's kind of, for me, I just switched amps because it's like I've got some of these amps. I might as well be using them live, because taking an FRFR to have some stage volume and some of that guitar feel, it's fine, but it's about the same size as an amp anyway, and I've already got the amp, so I'm not going to get rid of every single amp. So it made sense for me just to use like a hybrid setup. The amp can come or not. If I find out like it's a really quiet venue, I'll leave the amp at home. If I find out it's going to be just an in-ear gig, it can stay in the car or whatever. If it's a trio gig with Jake Loosemore, or like a band gig or pub gig like that, the amp's definitely coming because he's going to be using an amp. If your other guitarist is using a real amp, I think probably for most folks it works best if you use an amp as well. Otherwise, I think a modeler trying to keep up with a real amp can be quite a tricky thing, in my experience. So yeah, for me, the FRFR thing doesn't have too much of a place anymore, because I kind of decided I've got the amps. If I want them, I'll use them as a clean pedal platform, and never then have that kind of like feeling of like, does this sound real? It's like, it sounds like the amp, does it need changing or whatever? Is it sounding good? And that for me has been a really good transition, I think, because it means that I can still enjoy an amp. I don't know, that's a lot of rambling, but hopefully, Kyle, for you, it might help to make some sense. But yeah, as I said, I was speaking to a big amp company about this kind of decision making, and ultimately it's more down to, it's more fun to play an amp, and there's kind of something sexier about that than an FRFR, for me personally. I don't know if you feel the same in the comments, but that's kind of me. And the modelling goes straight to front of house. I have nothing against modelling. At home, I'm using modelling most of the time anyway. It's just that live, I think a lot of band situations, if you want to hear the guitarist, really do benefit from having a guitar amp there, or two, maybe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As I say, in the intro, I was using the Helix amp in the room tones, which is using a multi-tap delay to try and get some of that sound of like a room thing going on. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. Amps, maybe not for everyone, but if you can use one, I've generally enjoyed gigs where I'm using an amp a lot more than ones where I'm not. Let me know if your experience is different.